All right, good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thanks very much for the introduction, Jackson. As Jackson said, I'm pretty excited to be here tonight to tell you a little bit about my project on Canada Lynx. Initially, yes, Jackson had put me in touch with this group to maybe talk a little bit about Mauritius, but when I was emailing back and forth with Lou, we were talking about potential topics, and I mentioned that I'm currently working on this species, and she thought this would be maybe an interesting talk for this group. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Mauritius, but my talk tonight will be focused on Canada Lynx. So I've entitled this How to Hunt a Hare, or How to Figure Out How Lynx Hunt Hare when you are a curious biologist, as I am. And I'm doing this work as part of my PhD at Trent University. But before I go into Canada Lynx, I did want to give you a little bit of background on my journey as a wildlife biologist. As Jackson said, I went to the University of Guelph where I studied wildlife biology as my undergraduate thesis. And as my fourth year thesis project, I actually did a study on monarch butterfly migration. And this got me really hooked on research and wildlife even more than I already was. So I decided to pursue a master's degree in ecology. And for this master's degree, I worked on Canada jays, aka gray jays, with Dan Strickland and Ryan Norris in Algonquin Park. Some of you may be familiar with that system. After working on this project for a couple years, I was hired at the Biodiversity Institute of Ontario at University of Guelph, where I worked in their insect collections department. So that's me, that's my face right there amongst all these lots of insects. And then I actually went back to work with my former master's supervisor, Ryan Norris, again on monarch butterflies. So I actually, in this particular study, I was looking at how monarchs respond to milkweed abundance in right-of-ways, such as along this roadway here in Sarnia. Now, at this point, I had either studied or worked at the University of Guelph for almost a decade, and I thought maybe it was time to move on and try something different. So I applied for this program, the Canada's New NOAA program through Wildlife Preservation Canada. Now, if you've been in this club for a few years, you may recognize this gentleman. His name is Patrick Moldewin, and he's actually a friend of mine from the University of Guelph, and he did a talk here a few years ago about his trip to Mauritius. So I won't go too much into my trip to Mauritius, but he's kind of the one who inspired me to apply for this program, and fortunately, I was accepted in. Now, through this program, I did something called a postgraduate diploma in endangered species recovery, and with the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology, and I actually got that postgraduate diploma through University of Kent. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Mauritius, it is this tiny little island in the middle of the Indian Ocean here, east of Madagascar. It's very small. It's about half the size of PEI, and you may not have heard of it, but you've probably heard of its famous species, the dodo bird. So the dodo bird lived in Mauritius and nowhere else in the world. When a species is known to only exist in one location, we refer to that species as being endemic. So the dodo is endemic to Mauritius, as are many, many other species on that island. There are lots of species that you can find only there and nowhere else in the world. Now, of course, many species, both on Mauritius and throughout the world, have gone extinct through the course of human history. But the dodo is special for one very specific reason. And that's because the dodo was sort of the first species that we realized we had maybe driven to extinction. So before this point, humans didn't really think that they could have a huge effect on the world around them. But within 100 years, less than 100 years after humans originally arrived on the island of Mauritius, this bird had gone extinct. So this bird has now sort of become an emblem for conservation. Now, of course, I wasn't working with dodo birds, unfortunately, but I was able to work with an organization called the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, as well as the Mauritian government. And in conjunction with this organization, I was able to both visit multiple field sites and get really good hands-on experience in conservation, as well as take these in-class modules with experts from around the world on hands-on conservation programs. So it was an amazing experience. I got to work in beautiful areas such as this Black River Gorges National Park. Just, amazing biodiversity. Some of the highest biodiversity in the Indian Ocean can be found right in this small park relative to, some of Canada's parks. And as much as I loved working in the tropics and in this kind of tropical paradise, I learned pretty quickly after arriving that I'm not great at working in the tropics because I don't like heat. I don't like working in really hot environments. So, that was a good learning experience for me as well. We would be hiking up these gorges here wearing backpacks, and I just felt like I was absolutely drenched, like I was swimming in my own sweat. This just wasn't super pleasant for me. But little did I know that actually just 2 months after I would return from Mauritius, I would find myself here, basically the opposite situation. So after I returned from Mauritius in November, I then started my PhD at Trent University in January and immediately went up to the Yukon. I lived in a place called the Kluane Lake Research Station there, and it's right next to this beautiful lake called Kluane Lake, which is the biggest lake in the Yukon. And it's quite an isolated place. So in all of the Yukon, there are 35,000 people, approximately, and 25,000 of those people live in Whitehorse. And the rest of those 10,000 people are kind of interspersed around the rest of the territory. So it is an isolated environment. This field station is about a 3-hour drive from Whitehorse, so that's where we'd have to go to get groceries and other amenities. In terms of amenities, there's not much here. There's no cell service. We didn't even have electricity for the first 3 months. We would heat our cabin with a wood stove, so lots of chopping wood and stacking wood and stoking the fire and making sure that everything was nice and warm inside. And no running water, so we would drive into a nearby little town to fill jugs of water for dishes and these types of things. Now, I actually love living in this situation. I actually enjoy the isolation. It's beautiful. I feel like I'm in this wilderness. But of course, the real reason that I went to this area and the reason that you all came here tonight was to learn about this animal, the Canada lynx. Now, before I get into my study specifically, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on the lynx. So the Canada lynx is actually one of 4 lynx species that are found throughout the world. 2 species are here in North America, and the other 2 are in Europe. So in Europe, we have the Eurasian lynx. It's quite a large lynx, and it's not an endangered species. However, this Iberian lynx here is only found in a few pockets in Spain, and it's actually an endangered species internationally. So they're really cool animals, and there are all sorts of really good conservation programs that are aiming to increase populations for these animals here. Now, in North America, we have 2 species of lynx. We have the Canada lynx here and the bobcat. So the bobcat is a type of lynx. Its Latin name is Lynx rufus, and it is closely related to the Canada lynx. And often people have a hard time telling the 2 of them apart. They're very similar. Now, they are different in their ecology. So although the 2 are about the same body size, there are huge differences, particularly in the size of their paws. So Canada lynx have these massive paws in comparison to the bobcat. Now, these huge paws, yeah, I love this picture. These huge paws act as snowshoes. So because the lynx actually live in boreal forests, basically half the year they're dealing with deep snow. And so one really cool adaptation for these animals are these huge paws that act as snowshoes. In fact, when I'm snowshoeing through the forest, following some lynx tracks, I'll be wearing snowshoes, yet sinking into my knee, up to my knee, or maybe up to my mid-thigh, and I'm following the tracks of this lynx that's only maybe sunk a couple of inches, and it's just so frustrating. I'm just like, how? So really interesting. Like I said, this adaptation is great for the boreal forest of North America, where sometimes half the year or more, the landscape is just covered in snow. And this is actually a photo of my study area up in the Yukon. The lynx you can actually find throughout the boreal forest, from west from Alaska all the way east to Newfoundland and Labrador, and south from Ontario all the way up into the Northwest Territories. So this species is not endangered, and in fact, according to the IUCN, it's a least concern. However, there are some populations down in the United States which in the States are considered threatened, probably just because there's such small and fragmented populations down there. But for the most part, the lynx is doing pretty well, and it has this huge range that extends all the way across the boreal forest from one side to the other. Similar to the gray jay, which was my last, or Canada jay, my last study species. Now, the bobcat is kind of the southern cousin of the Canada lynx. So it also goes from east to west, but although there is a little bit of overlap here, you can kind of say that the bobcat is a specialist of southern areas, whereas the lynx is a specialist of these northern boreal forests. So that sort of explains that difference in paw size. These bobcats don't usually deal with very deep snow, and so it's not an advantage for them to have these massive paws like the Canada lynx. Now, another difference between bobcat and lynx is their preferred prey. So the primary prey of lynx is the snowshoe hare, pictured here in its white coat for winter. Snowshoe hare do change coat color, so in the summer they are brown, in the winter they are white. But of course, I'm working with these guys in the winter, so I only get to see the cute, fluffy white ones. In any case, the bobcat actually is more of a generalist predator. So that means that instead of specializing on one particular prey type, they're actually eating whatever prey is available and most abundant at the time. So they'll eat, birds, bunnies, even fish, all sorts of stuff. And so they're much more of a generalist predator. Now, the lynx and the snowshoe hare are famous for these population cycles. So anyone here who's studied biology or ecology might remember from your university or high school classes when your teacher might have described these population cycles of the Canada lynx. Now, the reason these cycles are so famous is because this is one of the best examples of population cycles that has been studied the longest. In fact, we know about these population cycles and the fact that they've been going on for hundreds of years based on records from the Hudson's Bay Company. So the Hudson's Bay Company was really good at keeping records of pelts. And so as pelts of both lynx and snowshoe hare were coming in, they were recording how many pelts they were receiving, how many they were selling, etc. But using this data, we can actually look back hundreds of years and know that this cycle has been apparent in northern ecosystems for all of this time. And so it's kind of the classic example of these population cycles. But of course, a main question here is why? Like, why do these populations exhibit these fluctuations over time, such as this? Now, despite the fact that we've been studying this scientifically for almost 100 years, the first scientific paper was published in the 1940s. We still haven't completely untangled the mystery of these population cycles. cycles, but we're starting to get a pretty good idea of what drives them, or the main drivers. In case of the snowshoe hare, the snowshoe hare is what's considered a keystone species. So if you can imagine an archway, there's a stone in the very middle called the keystone. It looks a little different from the other stones. If you were to take that stone away, the entire archway would fall in. And so ecologists have applied this term to certain species which, if you were to remove them from the ecosystem, the entire ecosystem may collapse, or at least just change completely. And so here is actually a depiction of the snowshoe hare food web in northern regions. So ecologists will sometimes put together these food webs, which are like linked up food chains, in order to understand a particular ecosystem. And in this case, what they've done is the more important interactions are with thicker arrows. And so you can see here that multiple different predators rely strongly on the snowshoe hare, including the lynx, coyote, wolverine, but also several bird species such as the hawk owl and the great horned owl. And then the snowshoe hare in turn actually relies on several plant species, things like willow, birch, grasses, forbs, and white spruce. And so these are some very strong interactions happening in this community. And so basically, the cycle is caused by the strength of these interactions. So at the peak of the hare abundance up here, there are tons and tons and tons of hares in the environment, and they're just eating everything that they can. And as a result, all of the best food starts to decline in abundance. There's just not the best food around. Or the best food is in areas where there also are a lot of predators. And so it could be that there's not quite enough food to sustain these high populations. But at the same time, there are these really high populations of predators. So there are lynx and coyotes all over the forest. But not only are the lynx and coyotes and other predators just eating hares, as many as they can find, but this environment is actually incredibly stressful for these animals. If you can imagine, that you come down into your kitchen one day and there's a bear there, and you don't know whether you should go in to get your breakfast, so you go back up to your room, and the next day you come back down and the bear is still there, and the next day you come back and there are 3 bears there. That's kind of a stressful situation. And that's kind of how I would describe the situation for snowshoe hares during the peak of the lynx population here. And so that stress actually has some really important physiological effects. And these are the things that we're just now starting to unravel. But one of the most important ones is the effect on reproduction. So as hare populations increase here, these hares are having tons and tons of babies. They're having like 5 litters a summer. They're, doing what rabbits do, so to speak. But at the height of the population here, when there are tons of predators around, when there's not necessarily the best quality food, and these hares are incredibly stressed out, this has some effects on their reproduction. So they have far fewer litters, and the litters that they do have, they actually are more likely to just abandon them. So that's what contributes to this huge decline. And then, of course, the lynx populations also decline, relieves a lot of that stress, more of the, food starts to grow back, and the cycle starts all over again. So that's kind of the main driver of the snowshoe hare cycle. But when it comes to the lynx, it's a little bit simpler in terms of the lynx population cycle is mostly driven by the abundance of hares. But it's not just the fact that lynx are starving to death, which they do. Sometimes when there are very, very few hares in the environment and lynx just can't find enough to eat, they'll just starve and die. But similar to the hares, there are other kind of mechanisms at work there which influence the cycle. One, of course, is reproduction. So some of you may have seen this article. It was on the CBC, and it was about this man from Alaska who suddenly found like 7 lynx kittens on his porch one day. I mean, can you imagine? 7 lynx kittens and their mom. And apparently, he was taking pictures, and the shutter sound of his SLR was making them curious, so they're all looking up at the camera there. Very cute. This is definitely a year where there were lots of snowshoe hares to eat. In years that there are very few either lynx won't reproduce at all, or if they do have kittens, very often those kittens will die. So we see almost no recruitment, almost no new lynx at all when there are low hare populations. The other thing that lynx will do is just get out of there, get the heck out of that area. So this is my study area in the Yukon here, and this is a lynx that we collared a few years ago at this place called Squirrel Camp. And it hung around there for a bit, and then it decided to go on a little adventure. So this is the data from its collar as it moves all the way up into Alaska, comes back around here, and then the battery on its collar died. Now, fortunately, we found out from the neighboring Alaska lynx research team that they had caught this individual in one of their traps, all the way over here. So the straight line distance from here to there is 425 kilometers. But obviously this animal moved much further in order to arrive at that location. So when there are very few hares in the environment, another thing that lynx do is they just leave. They go in search of food. They also have to contend with other predators. So I'm going to play you a little video here. This video was taken by a group that was actually filming in the Yukon at the time to make a documentary about the snowshoe hare, but because they were making a documentary on the hare, they wanted to, film some of their predators. So this is a video of a couple of those hare predators. So there's actually a lynx carcass just out of sight, or sorry, not a lynx carcass, a hare carcass just out of sight here on camera. And then there's this mammal here chomping away. Does anyone have a guess as to what that is? Yeah, I heard wolverine. That's exactly what it is. So this is a wolverine, and then here comes a coyote who's also infested. The wolverine very quickly chases the coyote away, and then proceeds to come back to eat the carcass here. So these are the types of other predators that the lynx have to deal with. And as you can see in this video, wolverine finds a brain of anything, really. So he just keeps chasing off that coyote. Now, interestingly, in my study area, that the coyotes are also very heavily dependent on snowshoe hare. So similar to the lynx, they cycle in abundance. They have this population cycle very similar to lynx. But that means that when there are lots of lynx around, there are also lots of coyotes, and they're competing with each other for food. So this is another thing that drives lynx populations down. Lynx will also take other strategies, such as just switching up what they can eat when there aren't very many hares around. So in this photo, there's actually the tail of a red squirrel sticking out of this lynx's mouth. So we do know that when hare populations are very low, lynx will switch to alternate prey. So in my study system, this is mostly red squirrels because that's just what's available. But they still prefer snowshoe hare, so they're still eating more hare than they are squirrels in terms of their availability in the environment. So they truly are still hare specialists, but this is another strategy that a lynx will use to help it get through that low part of the cycle. Now, as I said, the lynx population, it ranges from east to west and south to north across the boreal forest, but interestingly, there's actually variation in the cycle across its range. So in the north, you see these very pronounced cycles where populations increase hugely and then decrease to these big troughs over and over and over again. As you move further south, the cycle sort of peters out a little bit. And then once you get to the southern part of the range, there's almost no cycle at all. And the probable reason for this, kind of the main hypothesis, which seems to make most sense, is that there are a lot of generalist predators in more southern areas. And so those generalist predators are going to survive no matter what. So even if there aren't very many snowshoe hares around, they're going to eat birds, they're going to eat fish, they're going to eat anything else that they can find. And then as soon as hare populations start to increase a bit, they'll start to eat the hares. So this means that the hares can't have these huge fluctuations. They can't have these huge population increases and then the subsequent crash. And so lynx also don't really cycle in southern areas. So there is actually a lot of variation in this cycle across the range of lynx. Habitat can also have a huge influence on lynx. So their hunting strategies and their hunting success might actually vary depending on whether they're hunting in open areas or dense spruce forests, or maybe more deciduous areas with lots of aspen. And so these types of things can all drive differences in hunting behavior in lynx. So to sort of summarize what we now know about population cycles, we know that the population cycles of lynx are influenced by the number of hares predominantly. It's also influenced by the behavior and the habitat use of hares. So if hares are hiding in certain areas because there are tons of lynx around, that's going to influence lynx hunting success. Of course, there are other predators that the lynx need to contend with. And then there's the location and latitude, which all kind of feed into this population cycle. So what I'm interested in, finally, is how do lynx actually adjust their hunting behavior as hare densities decline? So I want to look at how kill rates of these hares vary across different habitats, how they might adjust their movement behavior as hare populations decline, and I'm going to be looking at individual hunting strategies, like which type of prey they're eating, whether it's snowshoe hares or other prey types like red squirrel, whether they're using primarily ambush or chasing down their prey, and how these change through time. So to understand this question, to study this question, I work in this part of the Yukon here, the Kluane region in the southwest corner. And specifically, I work between Clue Lake here and Haines Junction. This is our study area. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm working on the traditional territories of the Champagne and Aishak First Nation. They've generously given permission for us to work in this area and have also been incredibly supportive of this project. So I'm very grateful for that. Now, of course, in order to actually study these animals, I'm a part of a collaring project. So the best way to sort of get at these behavioral questions is, I mean, ideally you could become invisible and follow the animal around at all times without them ever knowing that you were there. Of course, this is not a reasonable thing to do. And so instead, we put collars on these animals and we track their behavior in that way. So in order to deploy, these collars that we deploy actually are more than just your standard GPS collar. So the collar has a GPS here, which is powered by this big battery. That's the biggest part of the collar. And it collects GPS points every 15 minutes. So every 15 minutes, I know where that animal was. It also has this accelerometer. An accelerometer is sort of like a Fitbit that you might have around your wrist. It measures activity patterns, movements in 3 directions. And lastly, there's actually a little audio recorder, a spy microphone that we actually order from Russia, believe it or not. And we attach these to the collars, and we can hear specific behaviors such as chases, kills of hares. Believe it or not, hares make this horrible screaming sound when they're killed, but also interactions with other predators such as other lynx. This is actually a picture from a camera trap in the summer of one of our collared lynx there. Now, in order to deploy these collars, we need to trap these animals. So we do that using these box traps. They're basically a big cage with this sliding door, and there's a pedal and a bit of bait in the back. And so the lynx will be quite curious as to what that weird thing in the back is, and will walk into the trap, step on the pedal, the door comes down. And so we check these traps regularly, and if we discover a lynx in a trap, we actually transfer it to a crate. This picture was taken by my dad, who is currently in the audience. We transfer the animal to a crate and then actually bring it to the nearby town of Haines Junction, where there's a vet clinic. I don't know if any of you have the American National Geographic channel, but there's a show on there called Dr. Oakley Yukon Vet. That's actually the vet that we work with for this project, which is pretty cool. So this is her clinic here in Haines Junction. And once we get the animal to the clinic, we chemically immobilize it or sedate it, and this is to help protect both the animal and ourselves. So obviously this collaring situation would be pretty stressful for a wild animal, and so the best, safest thing to do for both the animal and for our own safety is to put it to sleep for half an hour while we attach the collar. So this is what's happened here. This animal is sedated. My assistant, Amina here, is attaching the collar while Will and I are monitoring vitals. So we monitor vitals every 5 minutes. This is me pulling out the tongue of the lynx in order to attach a pulse ox machine. So that measures oxygen level in the blood and the pulse of the animal. We also measure temperature to make sure it's not dropping in temperature or getting too warm, and respiration rate. So throughout this procedure, we're monitoring the animal to ensure that everything is happy and healthy. We also take various measurements while it's under. This is us measuring the nice canines of this particular animal. And we also attach a little tag in each ear. So these are basically just colored tags that we pierce the ear of the lynx basically and put these tags in, and each lynx gets a different combination of colors, and so we can actually identify individuals by just looking at the ear tags, and so when we see them on camera we know who they are, which is pretty neat. Oh yeah, I included this picture because I wanted to show the size of their paw in comparison to my hand. This is only about a 10-kilogram animal, but it's just got this massive paw. This goopy stuff here is something called cat cow. It's like a nutritional supplement. So we actually put a bit of goop on their paw, and when they wake up, they lick it off, and it just gives them a little bit of a boost. We also give them some fluids as well, just to make sure that their recovery is as good as it could possibly be. Here, this is a lynx that we've just started to wake up, so we actually administer a drug that helps them to wake up and recover quickly. We give it a little bit of oxygen to make sure that it's getting everything it needs. And so this is a lynx just as it starts to kind of wake up out of its sleep and is ready to go back. So we make sure that the animal is fully recovered in the vet clinic. It's up and walking around and behaving like a normal animal, and then we bring it out and release it at the site of capture. So actually I'm going to show you a video. That same crew that came to record the snowshoe hare also wanted to record lynx, and so this is actually a video of one of our lynx releases. This cat's name is Bowser. We like to give them fun names. So this is him just running out of that's me in the back videotaping. And then just running into the forest with those massive paws. And you can see how little the animal is sinking into the snow. It's just incredible. I can't believe how good they are at walking on snow. Now, once these collars are on, we can actually go online, and because they are satellite collars, they actually connect to satellites every 3 hours and send all those GPS locations up to the satellites, and then we can go online onto a website and look at the data basically in real time, which is pretty amazing. My supervisor likes to brag about back in the day when he had to go out with telemetry gear and triangulate and all this, but I'm like, oh, I just go on the internet. So this is one particular lynx, and you can see here each of these points is 15 minutes apart. Oh yeah, this one's name is Lizzie. And what we can do actually is we can download those points onto a handheld GPS. So we might go and say, okay, where was this lynx for the last 24 hours? Then we download those points, and then we actually go into the field and follow their tracks. We do this for a few reasons. One is to see whether any of these lynx are in groups, because surprisingly, lynx, especially females, sometimes hang around in groups, even as adults. And that's something that even I didn't really know at all about lynx until I started studying these animals. So here you actually see 3 sets of footprints, and in this case, I believe that this was mom, and based on the size of the footprints, these were 2 kind of kittens from the previous year that were still subadults. And the reason I thought that was because you see this one big pair of prints that's just walking straight, and then these other two that are just zigzagging and like playing and rolling and everything. So it's pretty fun to go out and see what they've been doing. Another reason we go out though, and the main one, is to look at kill sites. So we're trying to find the hare kills, and so we can record where they were, whether there was a chase leading up to the kill, all this. And this helps to kind of validate the data we're collecting on the caller. So we're just kind of making sure that any events that we're hearing on the caller or any of that accelerometer data is reflective of what's actually happening out in the field. That accelerometer, as I said, it's kind of like a Fitbit, and what it does is it measures movement in 3 directions. So it measures g-forces both up and down, side to side, and back and forth. And so based on those 3 different axes, we can actually pull out specific behaviors of these animals, whether it's resting, grooming, feeding, or running. And unlike the GPS, this is basically running the entire time. It collects 10 samples per second. So it's not like the GPS where, it's 1 point every 15 minutes, but this is continuously running, so we can really get a good idea of what they're doing. And lastly, that audio recorder. Now I wanted to initially play you a recording of a hare dying a gruesome death, but I was told that probably wasn't appropriate. So instead I'm going to play you another clip, which is a little nicer. Hold on. So this is actually a lynx that's interacting with another lynx. So that, I don't know if some of you can hear that really deep sort of noise. That's actually purring. They purr when they're with each other, and they make all these really cute meow sounds, and they talk to each other, and they roll around in the snow. So that's pretty fun. Now, in terms of the actual answer to the question of how do lynx hunt hare, unfortunately I can't give you a full answer just yet, because I've been up in the Yukon the last 2 winters. Since then, the population of hares has started to drop, and I'm going to be going back this winter when there are going to be very few hares. I'm doing this all over again and trying to compare how these animals are behaving when there are lots of hares versus how they behave when there are almost no hares. This year actually was what we call a mast year up there, which means that the spruce trees produce tons and tons and tons of cones, which means that there are tons and tons and tons of red squirrels. And so I'm interested to see just how frequently they're actually catching red squirrels as opposed to hares, and whether they're basically surviving off of this abundance of red squirrels that just happen to be happening now. But even though I can't tell you exactly what they're doing, I can give you a few sort of preliminary results. The first is, like I said, that lynx actually are a little bit more social than either I or most people would expect. This is actually 3 lynx that were caught together in a single trap somehow. I don't even know how that would happen. Like, they were tiptoeing around the petal, I guess, and then somebody triggered it. I blame this kitten here from, the previous year. You can tell this one's a little bit smaller. It's got these massive feet, like, just amazing. But these 2 are actually known females to us. They're known adult females. And so we don't know how these 2 are related. Are they sisters? Is one the mother of the other from a few years ago? We really don't know, but we've seen these 2 together on our trail cameras multiple times. And in fact, at one point, they were sharing a snowshoe hare carcass. So one of them would go eat the carcass for a bit, and then walk off and start grooming, and then the other one would go eat the carcass and walk off and start grooming, and then they started grooming each other, and it was all very adorable. But in any case, we don't know exactly why these 2 are hanging out together. They're not the only examples of that. There were 2 groups of adult lynx last winter there were 2 of them that I said were basically attached at the hip, because every time I logged on, their points were completely overlapping each other. So they were never more than 10 or 15 meters apart, which is pretty cool. And we caught those 2 lynx on the same day in the same trap, but not together. So we caught one in the morning, reset the trap, collared that one, came back, and there was another one in the same trap. So yeah, so it's clear that they were hanging out together. I can also take all those points from all those lynx and plot them on a map of my study area. And you can see here there's quite a bit of overlap between points. Some of these lynx are almost completely overlapping. And then there's the odd one that just has this massive range, like this guy here. So these yellow ones are Mufasa. We named him Mufasa. This blue one here is Sebastian. And so these are both some big males that just have these huge home ranges. And then some of the smaller ones are some of our females, but this big blue one is a boy named Sue, is his name. We can actually plot their home ranges. So here this is from 2 years ago, but you can see how much these home ranges are overlapping with each other. And so it'll be really interesting, again, to see how much these animals are interacting with each other, because that's something that hasn't really been recorded very often. Lynx are often thought of as these very, very solitary creatures that, they're never seen, and they're especially never seen together, but some of our data is suggesting otherwise. Lastly, as I pointed out before, some of these lynx are making these big long-distance dispersals, and we've actually had 3 different lynx make this same trek from here over into this area here. So there may be some sort of dispersal corridor happening, and I don't know whether they go up and around the mountains this way, which I suspect, or maybe they come through here, or if they're just going on over top, which I doubt. But yeah, it's interesting that 3 different lynx have been recorded to go from here over to here and been captured by our Alaskan counterparts on this side of the border. I've also been tracking snowshoe hare abundance. So every time it snows, I go out and I do a track count across different habitat types to try to estimate where the hares are and how quickly they're declining. And based on my analysis from the last couple of years, they're definitely declining. They decline even throughout the season. So, their numbers are much higher in December than they are in March. And they tend to prefer certain habitats, especially kind of high density spruce. So it'll be interesting to see if that changes and how that changes over the course of the cycle. With that, I'd like to thank a few people, my supervisor, Dennis Murray, some of my collaborators, including Jacob Seguin, Alison Menzies, Emily Stead, Dr. Michelle Oakley, and Murray Humphreys and Stan Booten. Again, the Champagne-Ajac First Nation has been very generous to allow us to work on their traditional territory, as well as given us a lot of support over the years. The Kluane First Nation is where I actually live, so I live on the Kluane First Nation traditional territory, and I work in Champagne-Ajac. Kluane has also been very supportive, the Yukon government and Wildlife Conservation Society as well, for supporting this work. And this is just a montage of life in the Yukon, and I would now like to take any questions that you might have. Thank you very much for your attention. So the question was about collecting DNA, whether we do that. So when we attach those ear tags, we're actually able to take a very small sample from the ear itself at the same time. And we've been keeping those, and we have those, and nobody's done any analysis on them yet. But I would like to do that and understand how, especially these females that hang out together, how they're related, and as you say, whether maybe females are learning different hunting strategies from their moms, kind of thing. That would be really neat to look into. Yes?
What's the duration of these cycles? We used to be told 7 years.
So it's 8 to 10. 8 to 10 years is the duration of the cycle. Yeah. Yes, at the back. Right. So, yeah, so the question was, are they helping each other hunt when they're hanging out in groups? The answer is, I don't know, but there was a paper published way back in the 90s where through a bunch of snow tracking, the authors looked at whether, when these animals were in groups, if they had higher success than when they weren't, and they found that they were maybe slightly more successful at hunting, maybe, when they're in groups, but I'm not sure how they're hunting together. That would be really interesting, but I think to fully understand that, we'd probably need to actually observe them. Although those two females that were collared and always together, maybe we can sort of get at understanding that with those two. That would be really neat. Yes? Right, so the question was about vole cycles. So there are vole cycles as well, and quite pronounced, especially in Northern Europe. And they're probably driven by similar but not the same factors. So at least with voles, it probably has more to do with food resources, but also it is affected by their main specialist predator in Northern Europe, which is the least weasel. So it's a similar system, but the cycle is also a lot shorter. It's only 3 to 5 years on average versus the 8 to 10 years of the Canville lynx. So slightly different drivers, but similar idea, and the same idea where there aren't as many generalist predators in these northern ecosystems. And so that's when you start to see this cyclic population dynamics. We don't see those dynamics in southern areas where there's high biodiversity. We only see them in northern ecosystems. So that's pretty neat. It definitely has to do with, it very likely has to do with the number of generalist predators in the system. Yeah. Yeah.
When lynx first came, did you notice an appreciable variation in the animals' dental health and condition of
Right, so the question was about the condition of the lynx when they were sedated. I really didn't notice any kind of differences between them. They were all in pretty good shape, actually. I'm expecting to maybe see some differences this year, though, because there are so many fewer hairs. And we've been recapturing the same individuals year after year, which is really great for understanding how these are changing their behaviors. And I'm expecting probably that if we recapture some of the same individuals this year, that they might be a little underweight compared to previous years. There are a few lynx that have little white on their paws. That's really the only variation I can think of. Like some lynx have these white paws. We named one of them Snow because of these white paws. But and then there's another one that lives very close by, another male with white paws. So we wondered whether they were brothers, but I don't know. I don't know. That's really the only variation. Yeah. Yes. So the question was about squirrels and why they're not as tasty as hares. Lynx do climb trees and have been, like, there are actually some crazy videos out there of lynx running up and down trees. But they, you know, the lynx are particularly adapted to hunting on snow. And in the winter, squirrels spend most of their time in their nests. So they're actually only active for a couple of hours a day. And most of the rest of the time, they're up in their nests and they're not really visible or available to lynx. And then because these animals are so well adapted to hunting on snow, the best prey for them to eat and the easiest for them to hunt are the snowshoe hare. But of course, yeah, if there are no hare around, then they'll take advantage and try to eat some squirrels. And I'm interested to see if they actually change their hunting tactic. You know, if they go from pursuing hares to just sitting and waiting for a squirrel to come down a tree and pouncing on it, you know. So that'll be an interesting thing to see how they actually adjust their behavior. Yes, in the blue shirt. Sorry, what was the first question? Like how long they live kind of thing, or? Oh, I see. Right, okay, so the first question was about the life cycle. So usually females don't breed until their second year, but when there are lots and lots of hares around and population is increasing, sometimes they will breed during their first year. And they are thought to live throughout. There are some individuals that are known to live throughout an entire cycle, so they might live to see, you know, through 10 years, through an entire cycle. But we don't know how common that is, and a lot of animals do die during the cyclic low, like when there are very few hares around. There are lots, people find just starved lynx in the forest. So in terms of average life expectancy, I'm not sure. The only way to age them is by pulling a tooth, which I don't do because it's incredibly invasive and I don't need that information for my study, so I don't do that. But yeah, and what was the second question? Oh, during the summer, right. So initially, this study actually began 5 years ago. So I started my PhD 2 years ago, but it had already begun at that point with some other collaborators. And at that point, they did have some monitoring happening into the summer. But the reason that we don't do that any longer is because I want to collect really fine scale data. Like I want to have a GPS point every 15 minutes. And just in terms of the battery power of the collar actually only lasts for about 6 weeks. And then there's an automatic drop-off mechanism, so the collar just falls off and then I go into the forest and retrieve it where it fell. If I wanted to monitor in the summer, I would need to only collect a point, you know, every couple days or something, which isn't quite what I'm looking to do. And the reason we don't trap them in the summer either is because we trap them using all these smelly baits of dead animals and stuff, and there are tons of grizzly bears in this area. Like this is like the most dense grizzly population in the Yukon. So it's just really not a good idea to be like baiting carnivore, to your traps. And so for that reason, we do our work in the winter, as well as the snow tracking needs to be done in the winter as well. Mm-hmm. So others have done studies in the summer and looked at things like denning, so the females looking at how females behave when they've got kittens and where they're denning and what they're doing at that stage. But that's not the focus of my particular study, but others have done that for sure. Okay, how much time do I have here, Jackson? How many more questions can I do?
It's 8:45, and then there are 4 hands up. So let's just see if we can get through a couple of these.
Okay, sure, yeah. So the question was, do they mostly chase or mostly ambush? They do a little bit of both. And one of the studies that my supervisor did back in the day when he was doing a bunch of snow tracking, this was in the 90s, early 90s, he found that it seemed like there were more ambush beds, what we call an ambush bed, where they've clearly been squatting and waiting and then chasing. Seemed like there were more of those when there were fewer hares, but there wasn't a lot of data on that. And so that's part of the question that I'd like to answer as well. But they certainly do both. Based on our audio data, they do tend to chase a lot. We can hear them like running through the forest. And then you hear the hare die a horrible death. So they definitely do that. Yeah. Yes.
One, related to Lynx, to what degree do they scavenge on what kills, animals, etc.?
Right. So the question was, to what degree do they scavenge? We know that they do scavenge. It's not super common that they do. When it comes to wolf kills and the like, I think like these animals actually aren't as big as you might think they are. They're only about 10 kilos. They maybe come up like that high, you know. And I think they are too risk averse in their nature to approach something like a wolf kill. But they will sometimes, if they find a kill that's like the wolves haven't been around for a while, they will occasionally scavenge, but for the most part, they're just chasing down hares. That's their preferred prey, so not huge scavengers. They have been also known to scavenge on other dead lynx during the population low. So we're talking there are no hares, there may be no squirrels, and lynx are starving to death, and sometimes they'll come across another dead lynx and they'll scavenge on that. So yeah, they take what they can get at that point. Yes. Oh, sorry, you have 2 questions. Yes. Oh, how frequent is the aurora borealis? It comes and goes. Like there will be weeks where it is out every night, and then we won't see it for a month or something. Yeah, a good display like that probably only happens like once or twice a winter. We have a rating scale for them, and so it's like, don't wake me up unless it's like a 7 out of 10 or more. Because very often you'll just have like a green glow, which is really nice, but you know, you don't want to go out at -40 to stand and look at a green glow necessarily when you've seen them a lot of times. So,
You got time for a couple more.
okay, yes. For a layperson who wants to see a lynx, it's incredibly difficult. Basically, these animals don't show themselves, or the only way you'll see one is because it allows itself to be seen, if that makes any sense. One time, this is actually, I think, a decent story to kind of illustrate this point. We sometimes accidentally catch snowshoe hares in our traps. And on one occasion, my assistant went into a trap and the door was closed, but it was just a snowshoe hare inside. So she opened the door to let it out, which is what we're supposed to do. And then from right next to her, out of the bushes, a lynx pounced and grabbed the hare and then walked into the forest, and she hadn't seen it at all. So they are very well camouflaged animals. The way that the film crew does it is that they track these collared animals. The only time that I've seen a lynx kind of in the wild is driving up and down the Alaska Highway. Sometimes you'll see one cross the road, or paddling on a river in the summer. I saw one once just sticking its head out of the bushes and looking, but I don't know what advice to give you because it's really about luck. I don't, yeah, I mean, just spend as much time outside as you can and you're more likely to see them, I guess. Yeah. How many, one more, two more?
We had a hat in the back.
Hat in the back. What kind of predators? Not many, because they are so elusive and so well camouflaged. They don't get predated very often. They might be eaten by something like a grizzly bear or a black bear if they can catch them, or even a wolverine sometimes. But for the most part, the main cause of death is just lack of food. So yeah, they're pretty much the top of the food chain for the most part in my system. Yeah.
We have one last question here.
Cougars, are they prevalent in your study area?
So the question.
And are there any interactions?
So the question was about cougars. Now, in the past, there has been almost maybe zero or very, very rare records of cougars. However, this past winter, I actually came across some tracks of cougars, and there was actually a sighting recently of a cougar in the area. And the reason they're not usually there is because cougar eat deer for the most part, and there are no deer in Kluane Valley where I work. So there's not really much for them to eat. Like, there are hares, but they're not really great at chasing down hares. But I think the one that's hanging out there now is probably just moving through. They're extremely rare. It was still kind of scary finding the tracks, though. Not what you want to find when you're out in the middle of the forest all by yourself. Yeah.
I know Brian's going to kill me, but I do have one question for you, Rachel. So how do you see climate change impacting either the studies that have been conducted or the ecosystem that you've been working within?
Right. So first of all, climate change is extremely apparent in the north. In fact, there's a First Nations community up in Old Crow, Yukon, that's declared a state of emergency. The Dawson City used to have an ice bridge to get from one side of the city to the other, which this past year wasn't able to be made because the river just never froze enough. And so there are real problems up north with climate change, and it's very apparent. When it comes to lynx, there are two things. First of all, snow cover obviously has a huge impact on where these animals live and how they behave, because they are specialists on snowshoe hare and they have these huge feet. And it's thought that actually part of the reason there aren't as big oscillations in the south is because they just don't really have much of an advantage there in terms of hunting. Their populations are low. There's not necessarily a lot of snow cover. And so as snow cover declines, that will almost certainly have an impact on lynx and their prime hunting season. And the other point that I'd like to make is that in general, there has been some evidence that population cycles are diminishing or disappearing in some ecosystems, and that's thought to be because of climate change. So changes in climate, which actually influences the population dynamics of the species within that system, and causes those cycles to sort of diminish or disappear. So it is certainly something that we need to be aware of. And you know, it's hard with the lynx hair cycle because it's such a long cycle. Like, it takes 8 to 10 years for the entire cycle to occur, versus, you know, vole cycles, which are 3 to 5 years. It's a bit easier to study, but we're very lucky that we have these data going back hundreds of years, because it'll be really interesting in the next couple of decades to see how things are changing. Yeah.
Well, you're a great speaker, and you brought a wealth of knowledge to us that I didn't know, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room didn't know. So thank you so much for coming here to talk to us tonight. On behalf of everyone here at the Nationalist Club, let's put our hands together for Rachael. Thank you. so much.